It was the summer of 2013, and I had driven out to a small campground deep in the woods of northern Arkansas. I was 26 back then, working a warehouse job in Little Rock, and I just needed to get away for a weekend. The plan was simple: 2 nights, 1 tent, a small fire, and silence. I had camped plenty of times before, but always with friends or family. This was my first time alone. I wanted to see what it felt like to just be out there, cut off from everything. The campground was quiet when I arrived. It was Friday afternoon, early August, and the sun was still strong. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and the road leading up was half washed away from rain a few weeks earlier. My spot was at the very end of the lot, tucked between a few tall oaks with a small creek running a few yards behind. The closest other site was maybe 100 yards down the trail. I set up my tent, stacked some firewood, and laid out a folding chair facing the water. Felt peaceful. By sunset, the air had cooled down a little. Crickets started up their noise, and everything began to feel still. I cooked some canned chili over my small stove and watched the last bit of light fade through the trees. When it got dark, it got really dark. I could hear frogs, the faint splash of fish, and the sound of leaves shifting in the wind. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. Around 9, I noticed a flashlight moving far off through the trees, maybe on the trail that led to the main road. It flickered for a while, then went out. I figured it was just another camper heading to their car or checking the area. I didn't think much of it. I sat out a while longer, staring into the fire until the wood turned to red coals. Then I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and listened to the sounds outside until I drifted off. I woke up sometime after midnight. It wasn't a sudden wake-up, more like that uneasy half-sleep where something feels off. It had started raining lightly, a soft tapping sound on the tent. I lay there for a few seconds, then I heard what sounded like footsteps. They were faint at first, soft, slow crunches on the wet ground. They stopped, then started again. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, spaced too evenly. Someone was walking out there. I propped myself up and listened harder. The footsteps moved closer, stopped again. Then I heard the faint swish of clothes brushing against wet grass. My heart started pounding. I told myself maybe it was another camper, maybe someone walking to the creek to pee or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had no reason to be that close to my sight. The steps came closer again. I could tell whoever it was right near the fire pit. I hadn't cleaned up much before sleeping, so my camp stove and chair were still sitting out. I could hear something faintly metal, a sound like someone tapping on my mug, then nothing, just the rain and my heartbeat in my ears. After maybe a minute of silence, I unzipped the tent flap just an inch and looked out. My fire pit was just glowing embers now, giving off a faint orange light. That's when I saw her. She was standing just past the ring of light, half hidden behind a tree, maybe 10 yards away. I could only see part of her face and shoulder, but it was enough. She looked like she was in her late 40s or early 50s, thin, wearing a soaked gray jacket and long skirt that clung to her legs from the rain. Her hair was dark and messy, hanging down over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, angled slightly toward my tent. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't make a sound. I just stared through that small opening in the zipper. The rain made everything shimmer slightly, and I could hear drops hitting the tarp above me. She didn't have a flashlight, no backpack, nothing. Just her standing there watching. After what felt like forever, she slowly turned her head, looking down toward the creek. Then she stepped back, and the darkness swallowed her up. I kept staring out, waiting to see if she'd come back into view, but she never did. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By sunrise, the rain had stopped. The ground was damp, and the air was cold enough that my breath fogged a little. I stepped out and looked around. There were faint footprints in the mud, small ones, barefoot, I think. They led from the edge of the trees to where my fire pit was, then toward the creek. I followed them for a few yards until they faded into the rocks near the water. I couldn't shake the image of her face. There was something off about it. Not in a supernatural way, just something human but not right. The look in her eyes, blank but focused, like she wasn't really seeing me but knew I was there. I thought about packing up right then, but part of me wanted to believe it was just some local woman wandering through. Maybe she was camping nearby. Maybe she was lost. But there was no tent, no car, no supplies. I walked the trail toward the next campsite down, but it was empty. Same with the one after that. No one had been there in days, no tire marks, no trash, nothing. That second night, I debated leaving, but it was still early in the day and the weather had cleared up. The woods looked normal again, bright and harmless under the sun. I spent most of the afternoon fishing by the creek, trying not to think about the night before. But when the light started to fade, the uneasy feeling came creeping back. As soon as darkness set in, every little noise seemed louder. The pop of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. Around 11, I thought I heard something move across the creek, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I stayed close to the fire, trying to ignore it. Then, just before midnight, I saw movement again. Across the creek, barely visible through the trees, that same figure stood at the edge of the water. The firelight was weak, but I could make out her silhouette. She was standing still again, facing me. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring across the water, trying to figure out what to do. My car was about a quarter mile down the trail. If I bolted now, she could easily cross the creek and follow me before I reached it. After a few seconds, she stepped forward into the shallow water. The sound of splashing made every muscle in my body lock up. She was crossing. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the creek. The beam caught her halfway across, her clothes clinging to her, her skin pale, her expression flat. That's when I noticed something in her hand. It looked like a long stick or a pole, but I couldn't tell for sure. She kept walking forward, slow and steady. That was enough for me. I grabbed my keys, shoved everything important into my bag, and ran. I didn't even bother putting out the fire. I sprinted down the muddy trail, slipping a few times, my light bouncing off trees. My lungs burned, and every time I looked back, I thought I saw movement behind me. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath, then turned on the headlights. The beam lit up the trail I had just run down, empty. No one was there. I drove out of that campground without looking back. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I looked up anything I could find about that area. I found an old news article from 2008 about a missing woman. Her car had been found abandoned near that same stretch of woods. They never found her. I don't know if it was her. I don't know what she wanted, or if she even saw me that night. But I know what I saw wasn't some trick of the dark. That woman was real. And sometimes, when it rains at night and I hear the sound of water tapping on the window, I can still picture her standing there in the trees, half hidden, just watching. I still think about that night sometimes, even years later. It was back in the summer of 2019, when I was 26 and trying to spend more time outdoors. I had been working long hours at a warehouse in Kansas City, and I just wanted to get away for a weekend. No phone, no traffic, no noise. A coworker had mentioned this spot called Black Pine Creek somewhere in southern Missouri. He said it wasn't crowded, barely marked on maps, but had beautiful pine woods and a small stream that ran cold all year. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be out camping for the weekend. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, small stove, knife, flashlight, and some food. I drove out early Saturday morning and reached the trailhead just past noon. The trail started off open and easy, but after about 2 miles it got rougher. The trees grew thick, the ground uneven with old roots and rocks covered in moss. I followed the sound of running water until I reached a clearing next to the creek. The ground was mostly flat there, soft from pine needles, and there was enough space to pitch my tent. It was quiet, no signs of people, no trash, no fire rings, just nature. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong. I set up my tent, gathered some dry sticks, and got a small fire going. The creek was about 20 feet away, shallow but steady. The water looked clear, reflecting the sunlight that came through the tall trees. Everything felt peaceful in that kind of lonely way that's hard to describe. Like you're aware of how far you are from everything, and it's both calming and unsettling. As evening came, the woods turned darker faster than I expected. The sky went from orange to gray and then black in what felt like minutes. I made a small dinner on the stove and ate while sitting by the fire. The forest got quiet. The usual sounds, insects, birds, the wind, seemed to fade. That kind of silence doesn't happen in the city. It felt heavy, almost like the trees were pressing in closer. Around 9, I put out the fire and got into my tent. It started to drizzle not long after, soft at first, then heavier. The sound of rain hitting the tent was oddly comforting. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to it, half awake, half asleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up in complete darkness. No rain sound anymore, just stillness. Took me a second to figure out what woke me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling outside, not like branches swaying or rain dripping, more like footsteps, slow, careful, uneven steps moving through the wet ground. I froze. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavier, more deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise. I laid there, barely breathing. The sound came closer, maybe 10 feet from the tent. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then silence again, just nothing. I waited, probably for minutes, but it felt longer. Then I heard another sound, the faint click of something metal. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, like a piece of gear or a tool being handled. I reached slowly for my flashlight. My hand was shaking. I switched it on, lighting the inside of the tent, and for a second everything looked normal. My bag, my boots, the tent walls. I listened, but whoever or whatever was out there had gone quiet again. I told myself it was probably some hiker passing by, maybe setting up camp nearby. But deep down it didn't feel like that. The night dragged on. I didn't sleep much, just lay there listening to every sound. Around 3 in the morning, I must have dozed off again because I woke suddenly to another noise. A sharp tearing sound, like fabric ripping, came from the side of the tent. I shot upright, flashlight trembling in my hand. There was a small tear near the bottom edge, no bigger than a few inches, and it looked fresh. I stared at it for a long time, trying to think logically. Maybe a branch fell, maybe a raccoon clawed it. But the tear was clean, straight, not the kind of rip that comes from something random. I stayed up until dawn, too wired to sleep. The rain had stopped, and when light finally came, I got out to look around. The ground was soft from the rain, perfect for showing footprints. I expected to see animal tracks, but what I saw stopped me cold. There were human footprints, bare feet just a few yards from my tent. They were smudged but clear enough, toes, heel, the full shape. They circled halfway around the tent and then disappeared toward the creek. It made no sense. The ground was cold, the woods muddy. Whoever it was had walked barefoot through all of it. I followed the prints down to the creek, but they stopped right at the edge. I looked across, nothing, just trees and fog on the other side. The weirdest part was that my things were untouched. My pack, stove, food, all there. Nothing stolen. It wasn't like someone came to rob me. felt more like they were just watching. I decided not to stay another night. I packed up fast, barely ate breakfast, and started hiking back toward the car. The woods looked different in the morning, bright and calm again, almost like the night had been some kind of dream. But the footprints were real. The rip in the tent was real. About a mile into the hike, I found something strange on the side of the trail. A piece of thin twine tied between two trees, chest height, stretched across the path like a trip line. It looked recent. The cord was tight, still dry despite the rain. I stepped over it carefully, not touching it. My stomach sank when I realized it had been placed in a way that someone walking quickly wouldn't notice it until too late. I didn't know what it was meant for, maybe a trap, maybe just to scare someone. I didn't stop to think too much. I kept walking, faster now, eyes scanning the trees every few steps. The last mile felt endless. I kept hearing faint snaps in the woods, branches breaking, small movements, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the parking area, there was only my car there. No other vehicles, no signs of people. Just silence again. I threw my stuff in the back seat and got out of there without even changing out of my wet boots. When I hit cell service about half an hour later, I called my coworker, the one who told me about the place. I didn't tell him everything, just asked if he'd ever actually been to Black Pine Creek. He said no, he'd only heard about it from someone else years ago. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. Someone barefoot was walking around my tent in the middle of the night? It would have sounded crazy. I told myself it was probably some hermit living in the woods, or maybe another camper who didn't want to be found. But the trip line, that part still gets me. Someone had been out there setting things up. A few weeks later, I checked online forums for hikers and campers in that area. A few people had mentioned weird things near Black Pine Creek. Tents slashed, food taken, sounds at night. One post said they found a pile of small bones tied together with string near the creek. No one ever said they saw anyone. I haven't camped alone since then. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that feeling. Lying in the dark, hearing those slow, deliberate steps moving just outside the thin wall of my tent. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if I'd gone outside to check. It's strange how a quiet place can turn terrifying so fast. I went there looking for peace and ended up realizing how small and vulnerable a person can feel out in the wild, with nothing but fabric between you and whatever's watching from the dark. I went camping alone once, back in the summer of 2019. I was 29 at the time, living in Colorado and trying to get away from city noise, from the routine, from everything that felt repetitive. I wasn't an expert camper, but I had done enough weekend trips with friends to know how to set up a tent and handle myself in the woods. I chose a place near Gunnison National Forest, about 2 hours from where I lived. I had looked it up on some camping forums. People said it was quiet, less crowded, full of creeks and shaded trails. That sounded exactly like what I wanted. I left early in the morning, around 7, with my old gray Ford Ranger loaded with gear, tent, cooler, food, folding chair, flashlight, and a small hatchet. The sky was clear, and the temperature was mild. Felt like a good day to disappear for a while. By the time I reached the gravel road leading toward the forest, my phone had lost signal completely. I didn't mind. I wanted that. I followed the road until I found a small clearing close to a creek that twisted through the trees. The ground was flat and soft, with enough distance from the water to keep dry if it rained. I parked near a slope, set up my tent, and gathered some wood. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. The only sounds were water moving and birds somewhere high in the branches. I spent most of the day walking around, getting familiar with the area. The trail curved around a low hill and connected to another dirt path that seemed unused. I noticed old tire tracks in the mud, maybe from an ATV or a truck, but they looked faded, like they'd been there for weeks. I kept walking until I found a fire pit made from stones. It looked abandoned. Charred wood was still in the center, half buried in ash. It was strange because the pit was far from any campground. No signs, no trail markers, nothing. Just woods. By sunset, I was back at my site, making a small fire and cooking a few hot dogs on a stick. The air cooled quickly. Crickets started their noise, and the woods darkened in that fast, sudden way that always catches you off guard. I ate, cleaned up, and sat by the fire with a beer, staring at the glow and listening to the creek. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. There's a kind of silence in remote woods that feels almost heavy. Presses against your ears until you start hearing things that aren't really there. At some point, I thought I heard something in the distance. A branch snapping, maybe. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer. But then I heard another, sharper, closer this time. I looked around, but the firelight only reached a few feet. Beyond that, it was total blackness. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the trees, but saw nothing. Just shapes, trunks, shadows. I shrugged it off and went into my tent. I fell asleep fast, but sometime deep in the night, I woke up. It wasn't to any sound at first. It was more like I felt something, that prickly awareness that someone might be near. I listened carefully. The rainfly moved slightly from the wind. Then I heard its slow footsteps on leaves. Not an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. I froze. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I didn't move. I just held my breath. I could hear breathing, faint but real, maybe 2 or 3 feet away from where I was lying. It went on for a few seconds. Then I heard the crunch of leaves again, moving away toward the creek. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to unzip the tent a little and peek out with my flashlight. Nothing. The trees stood still. The creek shimmered faintly in the moonlight. I barely slept after that. I told myself it must have been a hiker who got lost or an animal that just sounded heavier than it was. But something about the breathing stuck with me. It didn't sound confused or curious. It sounded like someone who was just watching. The next morning, the air felt colder. I stepped out and walked around my campsite. That's when I saw the footprints. Not boot prints, but regular shoes. They were faint but clear enough to see the sole pattern, human. The tracks came from the tree line, circled my tent, then went off toward the creek. I followed them slowly until the ground turned rocky and the prints disappeared. I decided to stay alert but not panic. Maybe someone was camping nearby and wandered over by accident in the dark. I spent the day hiking further down the creek, trying to see if there were other campsites. About half a mile downstream, I found something unsettling. There was a small clearing with a half-burnt sleeping bag, an old backpack torn open, and a crushed can of beans. It looked like someone had camped there not long ago. The ground was trampled, and there was a smell. Not rot, but stale, like food that had been left out too long. I didn't touch anything, but the sight made me uneasy. I kept thinking maybe it belonged to whoever walked near my tent last night. That evening, I kept the fire smaller and stayed inside the tent after dark. I tried reading on my flashlight, but I couldn't focus. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not running, just slow, steady steps through the leaves. Then a splash in the creek, like someone wading through shallow water. I turned off my flashlight, heart racing, and waited. The sounds got closer again, and I could tell whoever it was had crossed to my side of the creek. I could hear the soft drag of wet shoes on dirt. Then silence. Pure, total silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard the faint sound of metal, like something being dragged, maybe a chain or a piece of rebar scraping on rock. I wanted to look, but I couldn't move. My body just refused. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I stayed frozen until dawn light seeped through the tent. When I stepped outside, I saw it. Across the creek, near a tree, was a man. He was standing there, facing the water, maybe 30 yards away. He wasn't moving. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and his hands hung at his sides. His head was slightly tilted down. I called out, but he didn't respond. He just turned, not fast, just enough for me to see his face. His skin looked pale, and his eyes were fixed straight at me. We stood like that for maybe 5 seconds before he walked backward into the woods and vanished. I started packing immediately. I threw everything into the truck, barely folded the tent, and didn't even bother to put the fire out properly. As I was loading my cooler, I noticed something beside the creek. Fresh footprints, leading from my tent to where the man had been standing. I drove off fast, bouncing down the dirt road until I hit pavement again. When I finally reached a gas station about 40 minutes later, I pulled over, shaking. I told the clerk that there was someone weird camping down by the creek, maybe messing with people. He just shrugged and said folks around there sometimes live in the woods, off the grid. I didn't go back to check. I didn't even report it. I just went home and tried to forget it. A week later, I saw something on the local news. A missing man had been found dead near Gunnison National Forest, not far from where I had camped. They said he'd been missing for months, maybe since early spring. His camp had been found first: burnt sleeping bag, old backpack, crushed food cans. I turned off the TV and sat there in silence for a long time. The footprints I saw around my tent, the man standing by the creek, the dragging metal sound. Maybe he wasn't the one watching me that night. Maybe it was someone else, someone who had already made that part of the forest their own. And maybe I was just lucky enough to leave before I became another quiet story buried in the trees. I never thought camping in a graveyard would be a good idea. It wasn't exactly on my bucket list, but here I was, sitting under a pitch-black sky, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. My buddy, Mark, had come up with the idea, and against my better judgment, I went along with it. We weren't far from the small town of Hartsville, a sleepy place with an old cemetery nestled just on the outskirts. It was a local legend spot, where the graves were said to date back to the 1800s, overrun with moss and ivy, the stones cracked and faded from centuries of weather. We arrived around dusk, the last rays of sunlight barely filtering through the dense tree lines surrounding the graveyard. Mark had brought his tent, a small two-man setup that he insisted we could pitch right in the middle of the graveyard for the full, spooky experience. His logic was that no one would bother us there, and if we were lucky, we might even get some strange occurrences to make the night more exciting. I wasn't so sure. The idea of sleeping between rows of decaying gravestones with the occasional rustling of the wind in the trees was unsettling. But I figured, what the hell, it's just a graveyard. People sleep in worse places, right? We set up the tent just in the middle between a few older graves. The air had that chill that settled in right after sunset, and the quietness was unnerving. No birds, no crickets, just silence. Not the comforting kind either, but the kind that presses on you, making you hyper-aware of your own breath. Perfect spot, Mark said with a grin, clearly not bothered by the eerie surroundings. He'd been to the graveyard many times before, saying it was peaceful, but I had a feeling he was hiding how truly creepy he found it. Yeah, sure, I replied, trying to seem calm, just a little quiet. He laughed, tossing a bag of marshmallows into the air and catching it like he didn't have a care in the world. I couldn't say the same for myself. I kept looking around, feeling like I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of the tall, twisted shadows of trees looming in the background, their branches looking like reaching arms. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the moon slowly started to rise, casting an eerie silver light across the gravestones. We lit a small campfire in front of the tent to keep the darkness at bay, though the light from the flames barely made a dent in the vast stretch of dark that surrounded us. We sat there, roasting marshmallows and talking about random stuff, trying to ease the tension. But every so often, I'd hear a faint sound. Footsteps? No, it couldn't be. The graveyard was supposed to be deserted. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or my imagination running wild. Then, about an hour into the night, something happened. A sound, a low creaking noise, came from behind me. It sounded like something heavy shifting. I whipped my head around, but the graveyard was as still as ever. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark, my voice just above a whisper. He looked at me wide-eyed, as if he'd heard it too. "Yeah, maybe just an animal," but we both knew it wasn't. The noise had come from the direction of a particularly old grave, one that had a large stone angel perched above it. The angel's face had long since weathered away, and the wings were chipped and broken. "I'm gonna check it out," I said, standing up and trying to sound braver than I felt. Mark seemed reluctant, but nodded. "Fine, but don't go too far." I grabbed a flashlight, making my way toward the grave that had given me the creeps since we first set up camp. The light from the flashlight flickered as I walked, casting long, unsettling shadows on the gravestones. My heart thudded in my chest as I reached the angel. The air seemed colder here, like a chill had suddenly settled around me. I shone the flashlight at the grave, inspecting it closely. Everything looked normal, just an old headstone covered in moss. But there was something odd about the ground. It was disturbed, the dirt uneven, like something had been recently moved. I knelt down, brushing the dirt aside with my fingers. That's when I saw it. A small, faded name etched into the stone underneath the headstone. * Samuel Green Star. It was almost as if the name was hidden, deliberately covered by the grave. I had never seen that before in any graveyard. I felt uneasy, but the curiosity was stronger. Suddenly, I heard Mark's voice call out to me, "Dude, get back over here. Something's not right." Reluctantly, I stood up and started to walk back to the tent. But as I did, I heard the same creaking sound again, closer this time. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Mark," I whispered, but the wind swallowed my voice. Just then, the beam of my flashlight caught something moving in the corner of my eye. A shadow, no, a figure, was standing near the edge of the cemetery, just outside the circle of light from our fire. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was tall, hunched over, and dressed in what looked like old, ragged clothes, but the details were too unclear to make sense of. Panic set in as I started to back up toward the tent. My feet felt like they were dragging through wet sand, and my heart was hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. The longer I looked at it, the more I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was studying me, waiting. I ran. I didn't stop until I was inside the tent, heart racing, gasping for breath. Mark was already sitting up, eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, too scared to say anything. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling softly outside. But that silence felt different now, thick, suffocating. Then, from the corner of the tent, I heard a noise, a low scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I turned, looking through the thin fabric of the tent wall. My breath caught in my throat, and then, in a split second, the scraping stopped. I jumped up, scrambling to unzip the door, but there was nothing there. Only the quiet, empty graveyard stretching out before me in the moonlight. No sign of the figure. The rest of the night passed slowly, every little noise making us jump. The fire eventually went out, and the cold seemed to seep into everything, but we didn't dare leave the tent. We stayed awake, eyes fixed on the walls, every muscle tense, waiting for whatever was out there to return. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were ready to leave. We packed up quickly, not speaking much. We didn't need to. The air had changed, and we both knew it. We didn't talk about what happened out there. Not then, not ever, but as I look back now, I know one thing for sure. There was something in that graveyard that night. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. As we drove away, the memory of the shadow lingered, and the quiet of the graveyard stayed with me for a long time. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 24 then, fresh out of college, and I'd been working nonstop for months at a job that felt like it was eating away at me. I needed a break, something quiet, something real. I'd been to the outdoors plenty of times with family and friends, but never by myself. I wanted to test myself a little, to see if I could handle the silence and the dark without anyone else around. I picked a place in northern Utah called Miller Creek, a forested area about 2 hours from any major town. It wasn't a well-known spot, but I'd read that a few hunters and hikers went there sometimes. It seemed perfect, remote but not completely isolated. I packed up everything I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, knife, lighter, my phone, a small first aid kit, and a few other things. I drove out on a Friday morning, the back of my old Toyota packed to the roof, and by late afternoon I was parked off a dirt trail surrounded by tall pine trees. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't completely silent. There was the distant hum of insects and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, but it felt heavy, like the forest itself was listening. I set up camp near a small clearing about half a mile from the creek. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp soil. The sun was still high, so I collected some firewood and sat by my tent for a while, eating a sandwich and just watching the light filter through the trees. As the sun started to drop, the forest changed. The shadows stretched out, and every sound seemed louder. The snapping of twigs, the chirping of crickets, even the soft creak of the trees swaying. I lit a fire before it got too dark, and the flickering light gave the woods an uneasy glow. It was beautiful, but also strange how quickly things felt different once daylight started to fade. That night, after I'd eaten and cleaned up, I sat by the fire for a while and tried to relax. The temperature dropped fast, and the air got cold enough that I could see my breath. I remember staring into the fire, hearing something faint in the distance, a crunching sound, like footsteps, slow and irregular. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't fade right away. Stopped, then started again, closer, then stopped completely. I didn't move. I just sat there, my stomach tightening. The fire cracked loudly, and I looked out into the dark tree line, trying to spot movement. Nothing. The woods looked empty, but it felt like something was out there. Eventually, I tossed a few more logs on the fire and forced myself to go to bed. I didn't sleep much. I'd wake up every hour or so, hearing what I thought were footsteps, then silence, then the wind. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. In the morning, everything felt normal again. The sunlight made it almost hard to believe I'd been scared at all. Birds were chirping, the air was warm, and I felt stupid for letting myself get so tense over a few noises. I made some instant coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to go for a short hike toward the creek. The trail was narrow and covered in pine needles. I walked for maybe 15 minutes before I noticed something odd. Along the path, in the dirt, there were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were small, maybe the size of a kid's, and they went off the path into the woods. I crouched down and touched one. It was faint but recent. The edges hadn't been disturbed by wind or animals yet. I remember standing there for a long time, just staring at them. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I got there. I told myself again it could have been from a few days ago, maybe from someone swimming in the creek or something. Still, it made me feel uneasy. I turned back and decided to stick around camp for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, clouds started to roll in. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was about to rain. I gathered more wood, built the fire up early, and double-checked that everything in my tent was sealed in case of rain. As night fell, the forest got dark faster than before. The firelight seemed weaker, like it barely pushed back the dark. Around 9, it started again, the crunching sound. It wasn't constant, but it was close. I froze. It came from the direction of the creek. Slow steps, a pause, another step. My heart was hammering. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound, but the light only reached so far. Just trees, nothing else. Then I saw movement. Not fast, just a quick shift between two trees, like someone stepping out of view. I aimed the light, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped again. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. The fire popped, sending a spark into the dirt, and I jumped at the sound. That was enough. I went into my tent, zipped it up, and sat there with my flashlight on. I could hear my own breathing. The sound didn't come back for a while, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it again. But around midnight, I heard something else. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, faint but right outside the tent. I held my breath and listened. It was low, slow, like someone standing inches from the fabric. The hairs on my neck stood up. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the flashlight, trying not to make a sound. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Then, a light tap, like a finger brushing against the tent wall near my feet. I jerked back and kicked at it instinctively. Silence. I waited another few minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to look out. The fire had burned low. The clearing looked empty. I didn't see or hear anything, but I knew I wasn't sleeping after that. I threw a few more logs on the fire and sat up until the sky started to lighten. When morning finally came, I checked around the tent. In the dirt near the back, there were prints again, bare feet, small, leading toward the trees. But this time, there were more of them, maybe 3 different sets. My stomach dropped. I looked around the area, scanning for anyone, but it was just me. I packed everything up as fast as I could. On my way out, I saw something that made me stop again. About 20 feet off the trail, hanging from a low branch, was a piece of fabric, gray, torn, dirty. It looked like part of a shirt or maybe a blanket. Beneath it, the ground was flattened, like someone had been sleeping there recently. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to know more. When I finally got back to my truck, I threw my gear in and left without even looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was just some local kids messing around, or some campers who'd wandered through barefoot. But the prints were too close, too quiet, too deliberate. Whoever it was, they'd come right up to my tent in the middle of the night. It's been years since that trip, and I haven't gone camping alone again. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I still think about that sound, the slow breathing right outside the tent, and I can feel that same heavy silence from the woods pressing against me. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know this much: it wasn't an animal. Someone had been watching me, moving closer each night, and if I'd stayed one more, I'm not sure I'd have made it out. I remember that trip too clearly. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 26 then. I had driven out alone to Pine Hollow, a thick patch of forest in western Oregon that stretched for miles without much sign of people. I wanted quiet, to get away from work and the noise of everything. I'd done a few solo camping trips before, but this one stuck with me. Maybe because of the storm, maybe because of what happened that night. I arrived late in the afternoon, just before the rain started. The air was damp, heavy with that smell that comes right before a storm. I parked my truck off a dirt road that cut through the trees, grabbed my backpack and gear, and walked about half a mile in before finding a clearing big enough for a tent. The grass there was flattened and muddy in spots, maybe from deer or someone else who'd camped before. It felt isolated, quiet enough that all I could hear were the distant croaks of frogs and the slow creaking of trees swaying in the wind. Setting up the tent took longer than usual because the air was thick and the ground soft. My hands were slick with sweat by the time I got the stakes in. The sky turned gray so fast it felt like someone dimmed a light. I gathered some dry wood under the tarp I brought and managed to get a small fire going before the drizzle started. First, the rain was gentle. It hit the leaves in soft patterns, that calming rhythm that makes you think everything's peaceful. I sat near the fire, eating from a can of chili, watching steam rise from the metal lid every time a drop of rain landed on it. My jacket was waterproof, but I could feel the humidity crawling through it anyway. The temperature dropped as the sun went down, and fog began to crawl through the trees like smoke. I could barely see more than 10 feet in front of me without my flashlight. When I looked past the firelight, everything turned into shifting black shapes. The forest felt endless. I remember staring out into it and thinking how easy it would be to get lost if I stepped just a little too far from the camp. The rain picked up hard after dark. Thick, cold drops that hit the tent like gravel. The fire hissed and shrank until it was just a red glow. I got inside my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to settle into my sleeping bag. The sound of the rain was constant, so loud that it drowned out every other sound. The wind, the crickets, everything. I lay there, half awake, listening to it hammer against the fabric. It must have been around midnight when I heard something else. It was faint at first, like a branch snapping, then another, not close but not far either. I froze, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the wet brush. But after a few seconds, there was another sound, something slower, heavier, like footsteps, not quick ones, careful ones. The rain made it hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. Every drop blended into the noise, but beneath it, I could make out a rhythm, crunch, pause, crunch, pause. My heart started racing. I kept telling myself it could have been a bear, or even just rainwater dripping through the branches. But I couldn't shake how deliberate it sounded. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The light cut through the tent's fabric in a soft glow. I didn't unzip it. I just stayed still, listening. The sound stopped. Everything went quiet except the rain. I lay back down slowly, pretending I wasn't shaken, but I couldn't close my eyes after that. Maybe 20 minutes later, I heard it again. This time closer. Crunch, crunch. Then a pause. It sounded like someone circling the tent. I could almost feel the ground vibrate under each step. I held my breath. I wanted to grab the knife I kept in my pack, but it was at my feet and moving even a little made the tent creak. I didn't move. Then I saw something, just a faint shape through the thin tent wall. A shadow passed across the fabric, breaking the pattern of rainwater running down. It stopped right beside where I was lying. I could see the outline of what looked like a leg, a human leg. The shape stayed there for several seconds. I didn't move. My pulse was so loud I thought whoever it was would hear it. Then the shadow moved again, slow, like whoever was out there was crouching down. The outline shifted, and I saw what looked like a head leaning closer to the tent. I could hear faint breathing now, soft but uneven, almost like whoever it was trying not to make noise. I didn't understand what they were doing. After a long moment, I heard the sound of wet footsteps walking away. They didn't go far, maybe 20-30 feet, and then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just rain again. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Eventually, exhaustion hit, and I must have drifted off in short bursts, waking up every time the wind pushed against the tent. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. The rain had eased to a light drizzle. Everything was soaked. My fire pit was flooded. I stepped outside, boots sinking into the mud. The forest looked normal, quiet and still, but I noticed right away that the ground around my tent was covered in fresh footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were deep too, like the person was heavy or had been standing in one spot for a while. The prints led from the trees to my tent and back again, looping around it a few times. I followed them a little way toward the tree line before they vanished into the wet leaves. The cold ran through me when I realized how close they'd been. Whoever it was had been there long enough to walk circles around where I slept. I packed up fast, barely eating, hands shaking as I stuffed everything back into the truck. The road out of Pine Hollow was slick and full of puddles, and I almost slid off it twice. The whole time I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the road behind me. When I finally hit the main highway, I stopped at a gas station. The woman at the counter said the storm had knocked out power across half the county. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my mind was still in those woods. I didn't tell her anything. What could I say? That someone barefoot had stalked my tent in the rain and just left. That night, when I got home, I dumped my gear in the garage and noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the side of the tent, near where my head had been, the thin fabric had a small tear, like it had been poked from the outside. The edges were stretched and frayed, just enough to make me think someone had touched it. I threw the tent out the next morning. I've gone camping again since then, but never alone, and never in Pine Hollow. Every time it rains at night, even when I'm home in bed, that sound, the soft, slow crunch of footsteps in wet dirt, finds its way back into my head. I still don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I do know this: it wasn't an animal. Someone was watching me, and for some reason they decided to walk away. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern New Mexico. I'd been working long hours at a warehouse job, and I just needed a few days away from people, phones, and noise. I found a small spot near the Carson National Forest, not far from a dirt road but hidden enough that no one would see me from the trail. I drove out in my old Chevy pickup with a tent, a small cooler, and a rifle I kept in the truck bed. The air was dry, cool, and the smell of pine stuck to everything. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, turning the sky a deep orange mixed with gray. I set up my tent near a small clearing where the grass had gone yellow and dry. There was a small creek a few hundred feet away, barely running, but enough for washing up. Everything was quiet except for the wind and the occasional crack of branches falling somewhere deeper in the woods. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. After dark, I sat by a small fire I made out of dry wood I'd gathered earlier. I didn't bother eating much, just a few bites of jerky and a beer. The stars were clear, brighter than anything I'd seen back home. I remember staring at the dark tree-line across from me, the way it looked like a solid wall, hiding everything beyond it. The longer I looked, the more it felt like something was behind those trees, watching me. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. You always feel watched in the woods when you're alone. I put more wood on the fire and stayed close to the light. Around midnight, I heard something move out there. It wasn't a small sound either. It was heavy, deliberate, like someone walking through leaves but slower, cautious. My first thought was a deer or maybe an elk, but then it stopped. Complete silence. No wind, no insects, I could almost feel my heartbeat echoing in my chest. I turned off my flashlight, crouched, and listened. Nothing. A few minutes passed before the sound came again, closer this time. A soft crunch of dry leaves, then another and another. It was pacing the edge of the treeline. I reached for the rifle leaning against a log beside me and held it, not pointing it yet. I waited. The sound stopped again, like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was paying attention. I stayed that way for maybe half an hour until my nerves started to calm down. I figured it had to be an animal. Coyotes roamed that area, and they made strange noises sometimes. I decided to crawl into the tent and get some sleep, though I left the rifle right next to the flap. I woke up sometime around 3 a.m. to the faint sound of breathing. At first, I thought it was me, but it wasn't. It was coming from outside the tent, just a few feet away. Slow, shaky breathing, like someone struggling to control it. I didn't move. I could hear the fabric of the tent shift slightly from the faint movement of air. I thought maybe it was a bear smelling around, but then I heard a sound that froze me solid. It was a voice, a broken human voice trying to sound normal but just slightly off. It wasn't clear words, more like soft, uneven sounds trying to form speech. But I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After a few seconds, I heard slow footsteps moving around the tent. The breathing followed the steps. I kept my hand on the rifle, afraid that any sudden movement would make noise. The steps stopped again, right behind my head. I could feel something standing there, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint shadow fall across the tent wall. Tall, with arms hanging low, like its shoulders were too wide for its frame. It stood there for what felt like forever. Then, without warning, it made a sound that didn't fit any animal I knew. A dry, broken mimic of a human groan, mixed with a rasping growl. My whole body went cold. I didn't move until the first light of dawn started showing through the tent. When I finally looked outside, nothing was there. No footprints, no sign of anything, just the quiet woods and my dying fire pit. I packed my stuff quickly. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. But before leaving, I noticed something strange near the treeline. There were tracks, not boot prints, not paws, but something in between. The front part looked like a human foot, but too long, and the heels seemed almost clawed. The prints were deep, like whatever it was had some weight to it. I tried to tell myself maybe it was an animal with a deformity or overlapping tracks. I wanted to believe that. The drive back down that dirt road felt longer than it should have. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something in the tree line beside the road. When I got back to pavement, I finally started to relax a little. But the weird part was when I stopped at a small gas station in Taos to grab a drink. There was an older guy behind the counter, probably in his 60s, and when I told him I'd been camping near Carson, he just stared at me for a moment. He didn't say anything, but his expression changed in a way I didn't like. Not surprise, more like he wanted to tell me something but thought better of it. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel on the way home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, following me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, this time in the motel bed. There was no sound at first, just that heavy, quiet air. Then I heard a single noise from outside the window, a short, breathy grunt, the same kind I heard near my tent. I didn't look, couldn't. I just turned off the lamp and waited until sunrise. When I looked outside, there were no footprints, but the dust on the truck bed looked like something had brushed across it, like a hand dragging along the side. When I got home, I told myself to forget it. I went back to work, tried to focus on normal things. But sometimes at night, when everything's quiet, I still remember the way that breathing sounded. Forced, uneven, human but not human. I started reading about strange reports in that area, and a few old posts mention people hearing things that mimic voices, things that move like animals but stand like people. They called them skinwalkers, though most folks just said that to make sense of something they couldn't explain. I don't claim to know what I heard or saw. All I know is that it wasn't an ordinary person or animal. It was something that knew how to move quietly, how to watch without being seen, how to make you question your own senses. Something that stayed just far enough away to never prove it was real. It's been years now, but I still haven't gone camping again. I sold my tent, the rifle, even the truck. I can't stand the sound of dry leaves crunching at night or the sight of tree leaves fading into the dark. Sometimes I'll be sitting on my porch late, and if the wind hits just right, I swear I can smell that same cold pine air, the one that hung over that clearing in New Mexico. It always makes me wonder if that thing, whatever it was, ever stopped watching me. Maybe it never did.